All right, great. I'm Kelly Clifton. I'm a professor of civil engineering in Portland State University, and welcome to the Friday seminar series. Today we have Amanda Howell. She is the program coordinator for Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon, and she's going to talk today about some work she's been doing on affordable housing and transportation impacts. And so this is work that she's been doing in California, but as you know, Portland also has an affordable housing issue, as does every, I believe, county in the United States. So it's a really important issue, it's timely, and I look forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. Welcome to the first Friday of the Spring Transportation Seminar. I was here in your seat last year. I will start by introducing myself. So my name is Amanda Howell, and I graduated from the MERP program last year. And as Kelly said, I now work with the University of Oregon as the program coordinator for Urbanism Next, which is a research initiative that's examining the transportation impacts of emerging technologies like AVs, e-commerce, and the sharing economy, and what those impacts on transportation, land use, real estate, urban design, and the implications for equity and economy and health and sort of that whole suite of factors. But that's not what I'm focusing on today and presenting. So today I'm presenting on a research project that I worked on both while I was a student and after I graduated. So the study is looking at the transportation impacts of affordable housing, and it's using travel behavior to inform development review. And my colleagues on the project were or at some point were associated with PSU or still are, and Kelly Clifton is the principal investigator who's been overseeing the research. Okay, so I want to start by setting the stage a little bit. So let's consider that I'm an affordable housing developer, and I want to build this delightful development. I've identified this great parcel in Los Angeles, and it's right across the street from a metro stop, as you can see here. So it's going to be a TOD, and that's great. And I'm thinking I could put 140 affordable units there. So that's my vision. What's going to happen next? Well, I've proposed it, and now it's going to go through a development review process that's going to include a transportation impact analysis. And the big question is, what is the anticipated additional transportation demand that my development is going to place on the system? And the city of LA wants to know that because the anticipated impact that we determine, they'll use that to levy appropriate impact fees. So that brings us, so the impact fees are they are required for the purpose of providing new or expanded facilities to serve new development. So basically I have to pay my share for the impacts that I'm going to have on the system is basically what that's saying. But that brings us to the next question, which is how do we determine what that anticipated additional demand is going to be on the system? So the industry standard guidelines for this kind of assessment are outlined in ITE's Trip Generation Handbook with data that's provided by the Trip Generation Manual, which I know Kelly has spent a lot of time looking at in her career. And these resources have historically been focused solely on vehicle trips. However, this approach has long been criticized as being insensitive to a variety of important factors, which include urban context. So ITE's data primarily comes from auto-oriented suburban areas that look more like this development or this context on the right. But as you can see, they're really different. So applying the same trip rates to these two different contexts is not accounting for the difference. They're also insensitive to socio-demographics and socioeconomics of income users. And why do I have these photos? Basically, IT has historically been focused on the vehicle. That's what they care about. They don't care about who's actually driving the vehicle. So they care about the DeLorean, but not Marty McFly. Who is Marty McFly? Why is he driving this? IT doesn't want to know, or they haven't traditionally wanted to know. It's also been insensitive to non-automobile transportation choices, like riding horses instead of driving cars. So a little bit of background. Obviously, households of limited means have fewer choices in both where they can afford to live and how they can travel. And nationally, we've seen the share of households that reside in rental housing rise from 31% in 2005 to 37% in 2015, while household incomes also receded. We're also dealing with the fact that the current supply of affordable housing has not matched the growing demand, and rental vacancy rates have also decreased. And then we have the fact that most developers can't afford to build new affordable housing stock for low-income households without subsidies to close the gap between their construction costs and then what those tenants' affordable rents will be. So that brings us to really the problem. So transportation impact analyses that rely on conventional data and methods may be placing undue costs on affordable housing projects because they may be overestimating automobile use. And that's really problematic when we're facing a critical shortage of affordable housing. So we may be making, the takeaway is that we may be making affordable housing more expensive to build than it needs to be. And in addition, if we're overestimating vehicle trips, that could lead to misdirection of resources away from the modes that these residents are actually really relying on, if it isn't really so much vehicles. And also, I'll mention that as of yet, there's no kind of standard method to differentiate between the transportation impacts of affordable housing residents as compared to market rate residents. So that's where we come in, or what we were looking at. So our research is trying to fill this gap by assessing the transportation impacts of affordable housing. And we're specifically looking at vehicle ownership, trip generation, income levels, and urban context. And the goal is to inform land development processes like transportation impact analyses and then the determination of parking supply. So here's a quick overview of our research approach. We used household travel survey data to examine the relationships between household income, household size, urban and regional context, travel day, so weekday versus weekend, and then the travel outcomes that we're looking at are home-based vehicle trips, home-based total trips or person trips, and vehicle ownership. So because we're working with discrete count data, so one trip or two trips, but not really half a trip or half a vehicle, we used negative binomial regression models. And then we made the decision to limit our independent variables to mirror those factors that would be available during the development review stage of a project. So for instance, what's your anticipated income of your residents? Are you building for market rate residents? Or are you building for affordable residents? And if you're building for affordable residents, what's going to be that depth of affordability, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But we also wanted to limit our travel outcomes to be able to compare against the more conventional trip generation rates, data and methods, so vehicle trips, although that's actually a pretty decent vehicle occupancy. And then comparing it to newer methods, which are really starting to look at person trips. So IT has started to use a method to extrapolate vehicle trips to determine a person trip rate, but that's the newer methodology. So we used the 2012 California Household Travel Survey, and they sampled from over 42,000 households across all 58 counties in California. And then we separated the households out between dwelling types, so multifamily versus single family. And then we matched their income levels to the regionally adjusted income qualifying limits that are used to determine eligibility for subsidized housing programs in California. And those are relative to the area median income, which is determined at the county level. So these are the depths of affordability. So extremely low income, you're making no more than 30% of the area median income. Very low income is 30 to 50%, low income 50 to 80%. Area median income is that standard. And then moderate income means that you're making no more than 120% AMI. And so then everyone who fell outside of that or above that we called above moderate income, so that's everyone else in the sample. And we did control for local and regional context, so these AMIs are set at the county level. So for instance, if the household was based in Yuba County, we applied Yuma County's AMI limits to determine where that household would fall income-wise and if they would be eligible for subsidized housing. So we also developed a set of place types in order to determine what the urban and regional context is. So we started by using Caltrans' Smart Mobility Framework from 2010, which provided qualitative descriptions of place types, and then we quantified them. So here's the process for that. We pulled 6 characteristics from the EPA's Smart Location database to categorize the built environment at the block group level. So over 23,000 block groups in California. And the 6 characteristics we looked at are population density, employment density, intersection density, like what you see over here, percent single family housing units within that block group, and then the proportion of jobs within 1/2 mile of a fixed service transit stop or 45 minutes via auto travel from that block group. So that's where we started. And then from there, we selected all the block groups that had 80% of its area within an urban area, and that's as defined by the US Census. So any block group that was deemed outside of an urban area, we just classified as non-urban. And then each of the 6 built environment variables were manually divided into 4 different intervals. And then each block group, kind of complicated, each block group was assigned a score between 1 and 4 for each of those variables. And then we used the average of those scores across all 6 characteristics to assign it to one of 4 place types. And so these are the place types we came up with: urban core, urban district, urban neighborhood, and suburban neighborhood. And then this is how it looks like when it's applied to the state. So all the green is non-urban, the dark red is urban core, and then out here is urban district, and then the yellow, all the yellow is suburban neighborhood. Okay, so just a quick reminder before I get into the model results. The independent variables that we're looking at are household income, which we classified, household size, which was in the travel survey already, urban and regional context, or those place types we came up with, and then the travel day, which was also already in the survey itself. And then our 3 outcomes are home-based vehicle trips, home-based person trips, and vehicle ownership. Model results. All right, so looking at the results, we found high levels of significance for nearly all variables. So in terms of how to interpret this, what we're treating as the base case for housing type is single family, so we're comparing multifamily to single family. And then for income, we're using above moderate income as the base case here, and then place type if we're using urban core. And so if we compare them, what this means is that compared to their single family, so multifamily residents compared to their single family housing counterparts, they make 16% fewer home-based vehicle trips, and they own 26% fewer vehicles than we would see for a single family. And then as their income decreases, so going into income, so as income decreases relative to the county median, that AMI, households make fewer trips. So they're making fewer trips, and they're less likely to drive. And then as they locate further from the urban core, so down here, they own more vehicles, you can see here, and they make increasing vehicle trips. So this is saying that 60%, you'd see 60% more trips in an urban district than compared to the urban core. And then people in non-urban areas, though, they're making fewer vehicle trips than those in suburban areas, as we see here. But that makes sense given activity density levels decreasing in non-urban areas compared to suburban areas. And then a notable result for the person trips, this over here, is that they do appear to be less sensitive to place type than vehicle trips, and a little less sensitive to income. So these bars are not quite as long. And so, for instance, extremely low income households right here are making 45% fewer vehicle trips than people above moderate income, but they're only making 21% fewer person trips. So they're still traveling more. All right, so here's what vehicle ownership looks like by place type over here, and then income level. And I think the results are intuitive. So households living in more urban areas down here own fewer vehicles across all urban contexts or across all income levels, and lower income households own fewer vehicles than higher income households, regardless of urban context. So here versus here. So AMI, if you have a higher AMI and you live in a suburban neighborhood, you own more vehicles down here, but then regardless, if you're lower income, you own fewer, and that is intuitive. It is worth noting, and I neglected to mention this earlier, that we were trying to control for different contexts in San Francisco and LA, and that did produce some interesting results. So we see that in San Francisco County, vehicle ownership rate is 81% that of all the other counties on average. So in general, people in San Francisco own fewer cars than other places in the state of California. Okay, so moving on to the home-based vehicle trips for multifamily residents. Again, here I think the results are fairly intuitive. So people living in increasingly urban areas make fewer trips across the board than people in suburban areas at lower income levels. And people at lower income levels make fewer trips than people at higher income levels in all urban contexts. So trip rates down here versus up here. And then if you're lower income, you're still making fewer trips regardless. And then we did observe an interesting mediating relationship with LA County and place type. So it's suggesting that there's a significant relationship between place type and LA County compared to all the other counties in California. And our results indicated that households in the urban core and the urban district of LA, they make approximately 54% more trips and 10% more trips than home-based vehicle trips for all other place types in the state of California, except for San Francisco. And then we're seeing it's a little bit less dramatic, or much less dramatic for urban and suburban neighborhood place types. The households in those areas are making 1 to 2% more home-based vehicle trips than other areas of the state. But here's the home-based person trips for multifamily residents, and here there is much less of a range. So urban contexts, we don't see the same impact on trip making. It's not dramatically different. We're not seeing that same pattern as we were with the vehicle trips. Although income is still a factor, so the way that this pattern looks. And that's somewhat consistent with what ITE and others' ideas that residential person trips should be less, they should be less variable by place type. So the consistency across urban areas may be due to the fact that people are substituting vehicle trips for other modes, and that makes sense because people do still need to travel even if it's not by car. And on that note, this is what the automobile mode share looks like by place type. So I think I'll say intuitive once again. So automobile mode share in the urban core is 41% versus 88% in suburban neighborhoods. So over twice as much. Okay, so then in order to better illustrate the magnitude of the effects of the independent variables, we also predicted the travel outcome of home-based vehicle trips. And these effects are shown relative to a base case. And this is our base case. So we're assuming a 4-person household with an above moderate income level. So down here, we're assuming that they live in a single family dwelling unit and they're in the suburban neighborhood. So in terms of how we interpret the results of this, if we look at, for example, someone who's above moderate income, but they're living in an urban neighborhood in a single family dwelling, we would expect them to make 95% of the number of trips that this base case household is making, which isn't that different. But it does get more dramatic if you move down here. So for instance, if we look at very low income households living in multifamily dwellings, and let's say an urban core, we would expect them to make 36% of the number of trips that this household is making, of vehicle trips. And that's an important distinction. So we also plotted these results against the trip data that's provided in ITE's trip generation manual for the land use code residential apartment. And so this illustration shows the degree of overestimation of vehicle trips when urban context and incomes are not considered. So here's ITE's average rate, and their data points are these little X's. And their average rate is 6.4 vehicle trips per dwelling unit. So these are the numbers of dwelling units down here and the number of vehicle trip ends over here. And then when we plotted our findings, what we see is that we would expect extremely low income to make 3.54 vehicle trips per dwelling unit, very low income 4.5, low income 5.5, and then moderate income 5.9, which is the closest to this average trip rate, but it's still below. So it does definitely look like we are potentially overestimating vehicle trips if we're looking at this data. So that brings me back to why does it matter? So going back to me as a developer, let's assume that I've totally forgotten about that other development I wanted to build, that TOD. That didn't work out, but I want to build instead this development in Pasadena, California, which is also just happens to be where I'm from. So I'm going to build 50, my assumptions are that I'm going to build 50 affordable units that will be available to low-income residents. So that's going to be my depth of affordability. And it's going to be located in an urban district. So as of 2017, the city of Pasadena's impact fees were about $2,700 per unit. Okay, so we used our model predictions to determine for the vehicle person trips how much each unit would be overassessed. And according to our models, every low-income unit would be overassessed roughly $1,200 for a total overassessment of $59,000 in transportation impact fees. And if I'm that developer, that finding indicates that in answer to the question, are we potentially making affordable housing more expensive to build than it needs to be? This starting to indicate that the answer might be yes. It is important to talk about a few of the limitations of the study of how we set this up. So for Pasadena, we didn't control for any programs or discounts or overlay zones that might be in place to reduce that fee. And then in terms of the data we're using, we weren't explicitly using data from affordable housing residents. We were using income designations as a proxy to determine if they would qualify for affordable housing. So as a result of that, the conclusions that we're drawing, it could be potentially overstating trip making differences because people actually living in affordable housing would presumably have lower housing costs, and therefore they have more resources left over to actually travel more and for other activities compared to people who would potentially have the same income but living in market rate. So they're spending more money on housing and have less for other things. Our models are definitely not intended to be sensitive to all the resources, conditions, and policies that we know impact travel behavior. We were trying to keep that limited. And then it is, I think, also important to note that our development of the place types was based on the context of California, and so they may not be necessarily totally applicable to other locations. So, and we can see this even with the differences between San Francisco and LA. So San Francisco urban core and LA urban core, we are seeing some differences between those two areas. So if we just applied our place types to Oregon, they might not necessarily match up perfectly. But that being said, there are still definitely some important conclusions that we can draw. So I think first and foremost, it seems that income significantly impacts travel outcomes. Our analysis reinforces the role of the built environment between vehicle ownership and use. So as people live in more urban areas, they own fewer vehicles and they drive less. And the comparison to IET's vehicle trip rate for multifamily shows a high degree of overestimation when income is not considered. The differences in person trips are less dramatic, as I showed you. So there is a difference between urban and suburban areas, but we don't see as much variation across those denser urban areas. Between urban core and district, those travel patterns are more similar. But income is still a factor. And that suggests that person trip rates may be a better starting point for evaluating site level trip generation. But the methods for evaluating transportation impacts still need to consider socioeconomics in their analysis, otherwise we might be overestimating those trips. And then it does point to the need for more information, which we are doing and did. So this analysis of the California Household Travel Survey is part of a larger study that we were working on for Caltrans, which is California's DOT. And we're actually collecting data at affordable housing sites. So we know we were controlling for the fact that people are living in affordable housing. And so last summer we collected on-site vehicle and person trip counts at 26 affordable housing sites. It was split between the Bay Area and Los Angeles and stratified by place type. And in addition, we distributed a mail-out survey to residents of approximately 100 affordable housing units, and including those 26 on-site collection locations that we collected data at last summer, also stratified by land use type. And then we're using the 3 different methods, so on-site counts, mail-out survey, and the California Household Travel Survey to crosswalk the data and test our findings. So these are the 26 affordable housing sites locations that we collected at last summer. This is a location in the urban core of San Francisco, and then moving down the peninsula, and then some urban district and urban neighborhood areas down in San Jose, Oakland, Hayward, which is a more suburban site. And then over here's our great suburban site in Reseda. Downtown urban core LA, and like Koreatown, East LA, and then moving down through South LA and collecting a little bit down here in Long Beach. In case you are dying to know what on-site data collection looks like, here are some action shots. So this is conducting intercept surveys and doing vehicle and person trip counts using a clipboard. And then really importantly, here's one of our data collectors experiencing Big Boy for the first time. So I'm also going to just kind of quickly go into some of the preliminary results based on what we've looked at with our on-site counts. So we have started to do analysis on that. And the preliminary results of our on-site counts appear to support our initial findings from the California Household Travel Survey. So these are Caltrans, so the data we collected vehicle trips compared to ITE's vehicle trips for the AM peak hour. And almost all of our sites fall below the ITE average rate here, although there is some variation across urban contexts. You can see that there are a few points above that. And then these triangles represent data that was collected in a previous study at affordable housing sites in LA, and we've added those as well. And they were primarily looking at sites with the fewer total number of dwelling units. That's why they're kind of clustered down here as compared to ours, where we tried to include some larger developments as well. So this is not so dramatic. But then if we look at vehicle trip rates compared to the PM peak, we do see a greater disparity here. So ITE's average rate predicts trips. So this is our average rate. They're predicting vehicle trips at a much higher rate than what we're seeing with ours down here. And then the other LA data, so here, does seem to corroborate our findings so far with that. We also compared our person trip counts to ITE vehicle trip counts. So this is the AM peak period. And here we do see a pretty dramatic difference for the AM peak hour. We observed many more person trips across all urban contexts than ITE's vehicle trip rates down here. And then this is the PMP comparison. So it's a little less dramatic, but there is still a considerable difference. And it supports our previous finding that by focusing just on the conventional method of counting vehicle trips, we are missing a number of other trips. And it also supports, I think, the point I mentioned earlier, which is that if we're overestimating vehicle use, that could lead to a misdirection of resources away from modes that these residents are actually relying on. So in terms of where we're at, there is additional analysis of the trip counts that we're doing, and then as well as the mail-out survey that was collected. Those things are underway, and the final report for that project is going to be available later this year. So I will wrap up there. I will also mention that the paper that we wrote looking at the California Household Travel Survey was published in the in JTLU in January, and so it's linked here if you want to take a look at some of the data and really dig into those regression models. So thank you.
All right, so questions for Amanda.
Should be good. Yeah, take that off.
Required fast.
Yes.
So I think that this is really important, not just for impact fees, but also for other requirements like parking requirements or things of that nature. But what I've seen is that when this sort of information is conveyed to the public, they just don't believe it. They're like, no, I see those people buying cars. You planners think that people won't be driving, but everybody's going to get a car, and then all my on-street parking will disappear, and my quality of life will go down. Do you have any recommendations? Because this is very compelling data, but not necessarily data that any random person that shows up to an event would be able to easily digest. Do you have any ideas on how to convey this in a way that would be convincing to non-planners?
That is a great question. I think, I think by trying, I mean, to some extent, if you take out some more of the kind of the modeling stuff, I mean, that's what I think I'm trying to do with, and what we're trying to do with specifically applying, looking at impact fees and actually looking at cities' impact fees. So we did that in addition to Pasadena, we did that with Sacramento. And so I think bringing it back to like, what do those costs look like, and really trying to make sure like that people understand that. I mean, one thing I'll also say in terms of, so when we were doing data collection last summer, we were working with a temp agency, and that's how we were getting all of our staff for the folks who were doing the actual counts. And in terms of trying to explain to them, because like when you're just handing someone a clipboard and asking them to count vehicles and people for 3 hours, it doesn't, why am I doing this? And so and Kelly and Jaime from Big Boy Photo spent time really trying to make sure that people understood like what the point of that was and why it mattered. And so so we were talking about, I mean, spending a lot of time talking about, I was using the example of like, if you are putting in a Jack in the Box and they assess that you're gonna impact traffic this amount, like there's gonna be all these new people who wanna turn into the Jack in the Box drive-through lane, and they have to pay a fee to mitigate for those transportation impacts, what that means for the system. And so I was kind of trying to like use, I don't think I'm answering your question particularly well, but like trying to really make sure that, like bringing it back to the fact that we really need to try and make affordable housing less expensive to build. So yeah.
I would just add to that part of the reason why they don't want to believe it is that they want to use this previous methodology that we have as a mechanism to stop multifamily housing. So it is one of the tools that NIMBYs have been using effectively all over this country to sort of suppress the development of multifamily and affordable housing. So whether they want to believe the facts or not, I think it's partially down to the own motivations for trying to interpret this.
Would you mind maybe giving a specific example about like if someone was going to build a property or out of their portfolio and it was like $1 million, what percentage or what amount is standard in the Portland area, if you know, or like what their impact is?
Oh, like what a standard impact would be here? I haven't actually dug into the impact fees in Portland. I will ask Kelly though. She has looked at some of that information. Kelly, she was asking about the what the impact fees potentially look like here in Portland. And I was wondering if because you've done some work on that.
Yeah, so we've been working with the city of Portland to change the way that they are evaluating impact fees. So moving from, they've always had a person trip methodology, but they have been using IT data. So we have moved them to a person trip methodology that uses person trip data. And so one of the things that is changing about that is that they're going to just value all trips equally regardless of mode and the assessment fees, but that the fees are largely based on the kinds of projects that are in the tip listed, so what sort of projects are planned for that location. And so I can't remember because I wasn't involved in any of the money piece, just the calculation of trip rates, but you can go online and see what that is if you go to the city of Portland on their transportation system development charges page. They publicize, I think the City Council passed that this past summer. And so the kinds of data we're collecting here, we actually have the programs, if anybody really wants to learn about standing out and counting people, we're going to have that data collection program for the city every year to try to have a more robust data set to inform this question. But it doesn't mean that a developer that is in an area that's going to have more walk, bike, and transit trips would ultimately be paying the same as the person that generates the same number of trips, but in a more auto-oriented area. It just means that we're going to try to have a better handle on what the trip making is, and then my vision is, instead of mandating or saying exogenously that these are the mode shares we're going to see, because ITE tells us that, we want to plan for the mode shares that we want to see. So do that through projects rather than saying, well, ITE says you're going to see vehicle trips, so it must be
Becky?
So for the first question, there's a great article called Why Hacks Don't Change Our Minds that I have found to be really fascinating, and which is probably a whole different and presentation. But I guess the question I have for you is, and I know you explicitly see that we're only looking at the income levels, but there's probably an elasticity of the alternative modes that are available in different locations. And I mean, it's in rural areas, like almost your only option is a car, as opposed to, or poor. And so I guess, was there any conversation or discussion about the availability of, like, if there's an extremely low income household, if they can afford to live in a place that is very transit rich, does that decrease their, car ownership or vehicle trips even more? Like, that's what my instincts tell me, but hasn't actually seen data.
So I can't remember if you talked about this caveat because it's trying to manage online stuff, but in the data set here, we are only looking at people who would qualify to be in affordable housing. So we don't actually know if we know that they're living in multifamily housing and they have an income that would qualify. So what that means to me is if you have a low income, but you're paying market rate rent, compared to someone who has the same income but is in an affordable unit, you're going to have less disposable income, right? So that there would be presumably even less tripping income. In all of the sites that we looked at, even the urban sites, residents had free parking at the location. Well, not in the study, but the latter part where we were doing the data collection. So all of the sites had free parking available, even in Hayes Valley in the middle of San Francisco, which I think was kind of a remarkable thing.
And in downtown LA.
And in downtown LA. So So your question is about transit routes being a more expensive location to live in.
That's not assuming it's not more expensive, but, you know, is that then offset? Like, I'm just thinking about, you know, maybe it's the parking ratios that are required for affordable housing, especially within, you know, the very first example, you know, starting from the, you know, the transit line, rail line, would people who don't have a car, maybe even sell a car because they get that affordable housing and they've got the transit options, they've got the transportation access, and they're not dependent on cars.
So they be paying more for rent.
No, I guess the real question was, you know, how does it affect vehicle ownership?
Yeah. So I think this is a question that I mean, Amanda's presented the household travel survey about car ownership in those places. That's why we're doing this triangulated approach. So we have this mail-out survey that is just rolling in every day, right? That's for getting. And so those data are collected at those 26 sites, plus an additional 75 sites or so around the state. And so we're hoping to answer that question. So do we see lower rates of auto ownership in these specific transit-rich, walkable neighborhoods or not? But it becomes sort of a complicated question in the household travel survey because, you know, there's not many developers building 3-bedroom unit, like market rate units. So it's the affordable housing developer that's going to focus more on providing those. So there's some stuff in the travel survey that we're not able to keep out in the same way that we're doing.
It's kind of a two-part question. So it sounds like the ITE data is something that is used nationally to determine fees, right?
Yes.
So is the goal to be able to come up with a different national standard to assess those fees?
I would say.
Well, I don't know if we want it to be national necessarily yet, because I think, well, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, the rest of my question is like, because it seems like this method, and you already mentioned it's specific to two localized regions in California, but even in urban settings across the entire United States, they vary greatly, and especially at the county level, which was mentioned that we base the income off of.
Right.
And I look, for example, Washington County, which contains just within that county some very specific centers of employment and housing, like Intel, Nike, and then extending west to farmland. And so would income data on a county level really be that effective of a tool? And so basically I'm wondering, are we trying to come up with a national standard or maybe just a method that can be used for jurisdictions to come up for their own regions?
Well, I would say probably more of a method than a national standard, because I think what we're seeing, which is, I mean, by relying on national standards, it's not sensitive to those variations. So I think, I mean, yeah, I would say it should be really about trying to come up with methods that can be used locally. And also just being more transparent from ITE as well, because that's been really a huge piece of the, I guess I would say, problem, which is that ITE collects all they collect all this information, and then, but they don't really give us any information about all those little X's that were in those graphs. We don't know where are they? Like, where was that? What was that data collection site? Was it Columbus, Ohio? Was it Los Angeles? Like, what was it? So.
And when was it?
And when was it?
1968, or was it 1985, or was it last year?
Yeah, and that's hugely problematic. So in addition, I think there's also just, you know, improving information sharing and making sure that those things are more transparent so that we really understand, like, where is this data coming from? Is it potentially applicable here, or is it not so applicable here?
I might be less kind towards ITE because I'm trying to work with them. But as Amanda said, that they get this data largely collected by public agencies or paid for by public agencies. And then they strip away information and then try to make us pay for it. Okay? And so one of the things that we are trying to push for is more transparency in that information, so that if you're using those national data, that you can say, I'm doing this project in Washington County. Where are some data with similar profiles of, you know, where the built environment looks very similar in the country? that are of a similar time frame and similar socioeconomics that, you know, so it's very expensive for local governments to go collect this data. So if you work for a local consultant, they charge between $8,000 to $10,000 to do one of these studies. So if you think about how each kind of study is very specific to, you know, the locations, that sort of replicating what ITE has would be very expensive, but a lot of what ITE has isn't, quite frankly, worth using right now. So what we're trying to do is not just with this study, but in a lot of the communities around the country that are trying to look for alternatives, to create an open source database that's an alternative to that. So even though this is in California, we have done a lot of work here in Portland. We did a study of 90 sites when I first got here around 2012. I was just in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has all of their data online and really accessible in their models. So one of the nice things and what we hope to do at the end of the project is to compare all of these things to see just how different it is. So if you're in downtown Washington, D.C., is that similar to being in the rural? Is that similar to being in San Francisco? So how about
Yes, here and then there.
So kind of going back to the ITE data, and you don't know when that data is from. And this data, of course, is very current and relevant now. But as you mentioned at the beginning, the difference in levy to the Portland area and the rental, the percentage of the population that's in rental properties has gone up about 6% over 10 years. What would you anticipate, or what would you predict might be like a shelf life, if you will, for this sort of data, and like how frequently should this sort of data be reevaluated to keep us from being in a situation like we are now, where, you know, the fees just aren't representative of, you know, the modes of transportation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, is it London? So how long does London keep their data for before they throw it out? It's
I think 10 years.
Yeah.
They sunset it. They don't actually ever get rid of it.
Yeah, so I mean, other places are using, so 10 years, you know, potentially like that could be a good cutoff. Because if you think about like how much has changed in the last 10 years between 2008 and 2018, there was a financial crisis. And, you know, things have changed dramatically. So I think, you know, that might be a good model to consider. And I mean, definitely anything I think is better than what we've been doing, which is just continually adding data from, you know, for years and years and years. And obviously things have changed, like really changed a lot since what we had in the 90s, or data that we might have collected in the 80s. So just the fact that they're just continually adding, there should, I think it would make sense to data, and 10 years could be something to look at, since that's what another country is using and modeling. Yeah. Hello?
So like we were looking at retail, or we were looking at bars and restaurants, like what you would collect 5 years ago.
So thank you for sharing your research. It was really interesting. I had a question about the gap between the reduction in impact fees based on the AMI health patterns and what like current subsidies for affordable housing look like, and how much of that could be addressed through lowering the impact fees for affordable housing.
So you're talking about, well, so there's, you mean, so how we were assessing what that potential over, the 59, over 59,000, what that over-assessment is?
So like, how does that over-assessment relate to what would be like affordable housing subsidy without adjusting impact fees, and how much of that reduction of impact fees would, how much does that address the issue of the subsidy required to build?
So that is something that someone who's a housing expert would have to answer. And so we didn't actually look at, because if you're a developer, you're charged lots of fees, right? So transportation impact fees is one, you have a water utility fee, for Portland, you have a park impact fee. And then there's all kinds of other things in the process. So often you see subsidies for just the land purchase even. So a lot of these big developments near transit, for example, have land. So that's a more complicated question. So what we just wanted to say is, how much would things be different if you correct this piece of the question? But I think there's lots of room for adjusting that process.
I think it also depends, if I'm understanding correctly, there's also depends a little bit on what the subsidy program is for that affordable housing, and at least definitely for I think everywhere that we actually collected data at, those were all tax credit buildings, so that's how people are qualifying for those. So yeah, I think there's also the piece of like which program, are you in the voucher program or are you in a unit that's already been made affordable via the tax credit. So it does, yeah, I think it does get a little complicated. But I think it's a really interesting question. Yes.
Do you see value in looking at other social factors like race or disability rates and their impacts on person trip?
Yeah, I definitely. So in terms of, well, I can't recall. I don't think race is, no, actually it might be in the household travel survey.
It is in the household travel survey.
Yeah, okay. But we were, so I think there is definitely, that is something worth looking at. For the purposes of what the exercise that we were going through, it's decided to exclude those because that isn't information that would be available when you're going through the development review process. So really the only thing you would kind of know is like what's, are you building for, what income levels are you building for, but that's kind of all you're going to know about those residents before you go through that process. And I mean, you would know potentially, we didn't specifically look at this, but you would know if you're trying to, if you're going to limit your population potentially to seniors, or if it's going to be, housing that specifically has different, for populations with different abilities. So you could definitely be building for that, and you might know that, but for the purposes of kind of using the most conservative estimates possible, so what would most look like ITE, we were just looking at, what's general affordable housing open to all. So looking only like at that qualifying limits, but definitely I think that's worth looking at for sure.
We do have one site, not in the household travel survey, but where we collect data that serves special population, but it's just one data point. So, but we are going to look at, how does those two rates compare to similarly situated housing elsewhere. But
yeah,
it's not enough to say anything statistically significant, but what we want to do is sort of plan to see that looking at these special populations might be the next.
Yeah. I will say though, from like, I was at that particular site collecting data, and from just a casual observation standpoint, definitely, I mean, so vehicle trips were much lower in that building, or vehicle ownership was much lower, so I think it was one of the only buildings I was at that the entire parking lot was not being used, and definitely seeing a lot more paratransit trips, and actually a fair amount of TNC trips as well there, so it's definitely for me, compared to the other sites I was at, like I could observe some of those differences just by the difference in population being served.
And those locations where we collected data both on the Howell survey and the site counts were incredibly diverse in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup. So I think we translated our Howell survey into how many languages? Seven languages.
And with that, and we were working with the property managers to get a sense of what are the most commonly spoken languages of those developments. And then when we were actually choosing our sites, I think we were trying to be mindful. So we're looking at place type, but then we're also trying to make sure that, not just place type, but, the, people living in South LA do tend to have a different racial and background and makeup than people living in East LA. Those are different areas. So really trying to make sure that we were capturing some of that information.
Yes.
Is bike share included as a person trip?
Yes. Yes.
Person trips are just all trips. Anybody walking through the door, regardless.
Important distinction. Yeah.
I might have already mentioned it, but perhaps you could explain further your reasoning behind using the above moderate income single family as your base case, and measuring everything off of that that specific case. Because intuitively, I would think that there's going to be a lot of pleasure trips in there as opposed to required, which could inflate numbers for any class of income lower than that.
Yeah, so the reason we're using that as a base case is really thinking about the comparison to IT, because IT, their data collection has been in suburban auto-oriented areas, and that we do know, so those data points are coming from those areas. So that's definitely, I mean, in terms of why we're choosing the suburban as the base case. And then the above moderate income, using that because that's giving us so most sort of, these people are probably, they are traveling the most. That's the base case, and it does look probably most like what ITE is using, or the data they're getting, which are people who, because if you're thinking about like area median income, so I think for LA County, the AMI for LA County is like, at the time it was maybe around 40,000, or maybe it's a little bit more, but it's not very high. And so if you're at AMI, you're making that much and that's controlling for a 4-person household. So 4-person AMI for LA County is around 40,000. And then, so if you're at basically above moderate would put you, that's still not like a ton. And so that's what we would assume, or we assume that those vehicle trip rates from the ITA look most like that. That's that population.
The other thing is statistically it doesn't matter. So it's really just saying what's your comparison. So it wouldn't change our results if we wanted to make the poorest, most urban group our base case. It's just how you interpret those results. So we could just rerun the regression, and the results would be the same. It's just how you interpret those results. That makes sense. So we're just pegging it against sort of the people with the most trip making potential. How do lower income and people stack up, and how do people live in different areas? We could have just as easily switched it, and then now we want to compare it to people with the least potential. But statistically, the results would be the same.
Yeah, sorry if you already covered this, but what governs or what's the requirement for data collection by these like state departments of transportation? Like how often do they have to like revisit and kind of update their trips? And is there anything that says, like, is there a federal requirement that says you must include these factors?
That's a great question. I want to make sure I actually Kelly heard that, because again, this is kind of her wheelhouse. Yes, very much her wheelhouse. So
sorry, that's okay. That's okay. I couldn't believe that. Maybe the second time would be more, but not already. But is there like a federal requirement that says you must, like, when you're doing this data collection, the state is doing that collection, that says you have to account for these factors, or you have to update it, like this maybe?
No. IT has lobbied very strongly to have a lot of jurisdiction use their trip generation manual as the professional resource. And some state or some cities have in their like local ordinances, that is the resource. And sometimes they even say it has to be like the 8th edition. And because no one ever seems to update these things, now IT is on their like 9th or 10th edition, but the law still says that they have to make version. So there's no federal standard here at all. The impetus for this study is that California is moving, their climate legislation is requiring a couple new things. And one of them is that projects like this have to go through CEQA, and so look through, they have to do a climate impact analysis. And so we don't want to unduly punish. So we already have sort of shown that in impact fees that affordable housing would be sort of punished more so than they should be for this. Then if you have to do an additional climate impact, we don't want to add another layer that prevents the development of affordable housing. The other thing that's happening is California in that CEQA process is moving away from using your typical transportation level of service standards, so like delay, how much delay or congestion is going to be on the system, to VMT. So they want to show that places have a reduction in their vehicle miles traveled. And so right now, with the data that we have in ITE and even the data that we collected, you can't easily measure VMT at the project level. So that's why we did the bailout survey, was to try to provide that additional piece of information. But there's no federal regulation. And IT is a, it's a private organization. And we're out of time. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, a couple things. So get all your information here. So your syllabus, a link to watching online, the speaker schedule. We will have 2 more speakers for this term. If you have questions,